Welcome to video 3 in a series of 4 detailing how to design a workflow in Visio 2010 and then configure that workflow using SharePoint Designer 2010 before finally uploading it to our SharePoint site and using it. In video 1 I detailed how to create a custom list in SharePoint 2010. The list we created was used to record basic expense information from our users. Video 2 in this series demonstrated how to design a workflow in Visio 2010. This workflow was going to check the value in our expense column and then perform an action based on the value of this column. At the end of the previous video, we exported our Visio diagram as a special file type. This next video is going to show you how to import that special file and then configure it to accurately represent what you're wanting to do with the workflow. To begin, we must first open the site that we want the workflow to work in. To do this, we double-click the Open Site button. In the dialog box that appears, type the site name into the site name field. Once you've done that, press Open. You'll need to enter the password for your site. SharePoint Designer will then download information about the site from the server. When it has done that, it will refresh and present you with this screen. This is where you manage all different aspects of your site through SharePoint Designer. I want to create a workflow, so I'm going to click on the Workflow button. You can see the page changes and my ribbon options change as well. I want to click on the option for Import from Visio. In the dialog box that appears, click on the Browse button to browse to the Visio file we exported at the end of video 3. This was called Expense Workflow. I select it by clicking on its name, then press Open. We then press Next. We have 3 options. We can rename the workflow if we wish. We can then choose to import the workflow either as a list workflow. This means it is attached to a specific list within SharePoint. Or we can import it as a reusable workflow. Reusable workflows are attached to content types rather than specific lists or libraries. This means they can be reused across different sites within your site collection. For this example, we're going to import it as a list workflow. Using the drop-down, select the list we created in video 1. This was called Expenses. We then press Finish. The screen, SharePoint Designer has taken the diagram items we drew in Visio and then added in the corresponding SharePoint Designer action or condition. The blue underlined text indicates areas that we can click on to further configure this workflow. Our first line we have that we can configure is if value this test value. This was the first item we added to the diagram, the compare data field sources. If we click on the first text entry, we can now choose our field that we want to compare. We click on the function button to the right hand side and we're brought to this screen. This is where we define the workflow lookup. This is where we choose the field or column in our original list that we want to compare in this workflow. Data source, this is the list we are looking in. It's preset to current item. The current item being the list we associated the workflow with in the first part of this workthrough. Field from source, we have to choose the field. If you remember, in video 1 we created a column called expense value, and that's the value we're wanting to perform our workflow on. We select that then press OK. We can now see it's filled in with if current item, so if expense list, field expense value. If we then click on this test, it presents us with some options. We want to choose is greater than, because the next field we fill in is our value, which is going to be our £100 value. So we type in 100. So that line now reads, if current item, expense list, field expense value is greater than 100. We then move on to our next diagram item that we drew, request further details from user. So if the expense item value is greater than 100, we're going to collect data from this user, and then we're going to output that data so we can look at it again. If I click on the underlined data text, I'm brought to this wizard here. This wizard allows me to create a task that contains fields where I can collect my information from. Press the next button. I'm asked to give my task a name. I'm going to call mine further information required expense item. We can add a description if we so wish. I then click next. I've now got to decide which fields and which bits of information I want to request from my user. To do this, I click on the add button, and I'm brought to a new dialog box where I can define the fields that I want to gather information on. So I think my first field name is going to be comments, and I'm going to make this a multiple lines of text field. Then I'm going to press the next button. Allow blank values. I'll deselect that because I want my user to fill in some information, and I'm going to deselect the rich text option. If we leave the rich text option on, the workflow will return with an error. Press finish. We have now created a comments field. I also want to create a field for my user to fill in the name of the client that they accrued the expense for. So I'm going to click add again, and in field name I'm going to put in client, and I'm going to make this a choice menu type. Select the next button, and I can fill in my choices. So my clients are Microsoft, Big Corp and Wee Corp. No to allow fill-in choices, and I'm going to deselect allow blank values. I then press finish. I have now created two fields to collect information from my users. When I'm finished doing this, I press the finish button, and we can see I now have collect further information required expense item. That was the title I created with my fields in it. I now need to specify who is going to be required to give me this information. To do this, I click on the this user underlined text options. I have a list of all the groups and different users within my site. I've also got some presets, workflow lookup for a user. The option I'm going to use though is a user who created current item. Double click their name, and we can see this appears in the field on the right hand side. That means they've been selected. I then press OK. We can see on this line the next field that I have to fill in is I have to decide where to output the information that I'm collecting from my user. So I click on the collect option, and I want to create a new variable. Give it a name, so expense info, and it's got to be a list item ID. This is because the information gathered from the user at this point is held in a list, and if I ever want to pull that information back again, I need to have the list item ID number so I can find that reference in the list at a future date. Then press OK, and we can see my next line has been filled out. I'm going to collect further information required, re-expense item, from the user who created that expense item, and I'm going to output it to expense info. The next stage of my workflow is once this information has been collected, I then want to start the approval process, because then it will be up to the approver if they want to approve the expense item once they have the additional information. We can see approval, although highlighted, is greyed out. This is because this links into the pre-existing approval workflow that comes as standard with SharePoint. If you want to make any changes to this, you have to change the actual approval workflow. This is unnecessary in our workflow that we're doing, as we are wanting to make use of the full approval workflow capabilities that come as standard with SharePoint. We do, however, have to fill in 2 additional pieces of information. Start the process on, we have this item highlighted. If we click on that, the default is a current item. You do have the option that you can use other lists to start approval on them, but for the purposes of this workflow, we want to start the approval process on that item, so we are going to leave that as current item and press OK. The final piece of blue text we have for this line is these users. This is where we specify the users who are going to take part in the approval process. I'm just going to add administrator and send the approval to them. I also have options here where I can CC in additional people. I can add a title to my task request, so expense approval. Please approve this expense and see additional information. I can choose a duration per task, how long I want each user to spend on the task before it's no longer valid, and then if there's a due date for the entire task process. I'm going to leave those blank for the moment and just press OK. We have now finished this section of our workflow. We now see if the current list item is greater than 100. We're going to collect further information from our user. We're then going to send the workflow off for approval to the administrator. Our next section we can see is started with an else clause. This indicates that if this clause here, the if current item is greater than 100, is not met, then this is the action to take. So for example, if the expense is less than 100, what's the process the workflow has to do? And in this case, it just has to start the approval process again. This is the same step as we completed previously. So again, I'm going to leave the approval link and not touch that, as we want to make use of this. I'm going to click on this item and use the default current item and press OK. Then with the These Users column, I'm going to add the administrator. I'm putting the title, then press OK. Our workflow has now been completed. The next step we have to do is we have to check our workflow for errors. Although in Visio we checked the workflow and there was no errors, we have encountered some errors in SharePoint Designer when we've been inputting these values that were underlined in blue text. To check the workflow for errors, I go up to the ribbon and I click on the Check for Errors button. We can see the workflow contains no errors. Press OK to this. We have now completed our workflow, made some further configurations to the workflow so it behaves in the way we want it to behave. To do this, press on the Expenses workflow, and we want to look at the Start Options section. we want to start this workflow automatically when an item is created. Do this by checking the box beside its name, and we're going to deselect the option to allow this workflow to be manually started. Now that we've made our final changes to the workflow, press Save. This will save the workflow. Once we've saved the workflow, we want to publish it to our site. We do this by pressing the Publish button. We have now saved and published our workflow. That's the end of video 3. In this video, we have imported our Visio diagram detailing our SharePoint workflow. We've then configured the workflow in SharePoint Designer. We've then saved and published the workflow to our site. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to check the workflow has been attached to the list, and we're actually going to see our workflow working.